Hey everyone! Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind you guys again to please check out some of my other YouTube channels in the description down below. I have a Star Wars Battlefront 2 Classic focused channel where I review custom maps and mods on the Battlefront Max channel. I do gaming reviews on the Kanoa Reviews channel, and have also recently started a Minecraft adventure channel where I play through classic adventures with friends. You can find the links in the description, and please subscribe to those channels if you like what you see. It had been a little over 2 weeks since officially the newly forged Allies declared its war against the brainless horde of zombies that had gotten out of control. Countries like Portugal and Spain had fought the undead before that on their own, but help was now on the way. The damage, however, had already been done, and most of Portugal had been swallowed up by the rotting corpses. The overall number of zombies currently in the world was estimated in being in the millions, but Intel was still surveying and collecting data to confirm this assessment. Though most countries stood behind the Allies in their war against the zombies, fascist countries like Italy were still refusing to partake, though again, the cry for help and aid did grow in that country as well. Some believed that over the next couple of months, political figures who vowed to join hands against the undead threat would rise in popularity. And though for the moment the officials did not want to know any of that, they were not tone deaf to the actual threat of it, as they moved their northern African forces to the east, where Britain was still engaged with the zombies at the Suez. It also did not help that Italy for the moment was in conflict with Ethiopia, a nation where none of the zombies' news was on anyone's radar. They waged their battles as if the rest of the world had frozen in time. And in the third week of January 1936, it indeed came to light on how many zombies there were estimated in the world. Several reports came to the conclusion that there were anywhere between 8 and 9 million zombies. Some believe this to be better than expected, since earlier reports named numbers as high as 20 million. But nevertheless, for the moment, the zombies were still advancing on almost all fronts, meaning that it was important to push back and send more armor and well-equipped soldiers to the front lines. But even though the zombies were in their millions, not everywhere in the world did people seem to care about the problem. In Europe, the Middle East, and both North and South America, the topic was at hand. But in Asia, this was not the case, with the zombies being a problem that may be considered way too far to even care about. Some nations were more intertwined in internal politics or possible conflicts between different ideologies. For the ignorance was bliss. Spain's current government was heavily investing in an emergency political effort program. They already knew they did not have the resources or manpower to deal with the zombies at hand, and therefore would need to rely on the help of other nations. The political effort could help with convincing more countries to join the Allies or ship units towards the Spanish front, something that not all Allied nations had promised yet. France, for example, was currently focused on defensive countermeasures for when the zombie horde would reach their border. They also realized that Spain would not be able to hold off against the zombies, and that it was only a matter of time before they had to fight the enemy on French soil. Bunkers, trenches, and outposts were erected everywhere in preparation for this. In Holland, leader Hendrikus Colijn set in motion an aviation effort. Their nation was far too small to make any significant difference at the front with manpower, but in terms of planes and bombardments, they could help. The KLM, standing for Koninklijke Luchtvaartmaatschappij, would aid in this. Turkey, on the other hand, was still focused on army effort, since they realized that most of Europe's eyes were in the Spanish direction until it would be too late for the Turkish. The Middle Eastern deserts were a hive for multiple zombie hordes, aimlessly walking about in nothingness. Multiple photos taken by planes flying by showed the scale on what the nations of Earth had to deal with. At the end of January, more nations joined the Allies in their struggle against the undead menace. The battle in Brazil lingered on as well. With Mexico being the main focal point in the US and Canada, it were mostly other South American countries where the news about the horde in Brazil spread like wildfire. News on the topic was often scattered and inaccurate. In some ways, the state of the communication networks in a few of these countries still predated the current century. But then indeed in February, the news became official that Brazil had fallen, suddenly making it headline in newspapers all across the globe again. If a nation this big would be able to fall, were others soon to follow? Everyone knew what would come next. Neighboring, smaller countries would first fall victim to the gnawing jaws of the zombies. They were much smaller and could not compete like Brazil did in vain. Many of the inhabitants knew this to be true as well, and many had fled before the battle had even started at the border. A mere week later, Iran had fallen. Though the people in the West did not pay as much attention to this as with the news about Brazil, in Asia, things now started to get turmoil. With part of the zombie horde heading east, it would be a matter of months before they would reach over into Asian territories like the British Raj. Turkey, on the other hand, was not even close to capitulating, but they did lose almost half of their territory to the rotting undead already. Venezuela was the next country that fell to the zombies, and no one was surprised. But by now, 4 countries had fallen to the undead already in just 2 months. This did raise the alarms with several other nations, even in the continents where the zombie presence was not yet an issue. The number of dead stood at around 140,000 for the Allies, and they had killed only about half of that number of undead. It was strange to some, since many soldiers often had the feeling they were killing the zombies by the dozens, whereas they did not suffer that many casualties. It was mostly because the zombies were slow and easy targets, but this made some of the soldiers cocky and unaware of their surroundings. It happened more than once that entire groups of fighting men were surrounded and closed in by the zombies, resulting in an entire wipe. In Mexico, the war with the zombies continued on at a slower pace compared to other fronts. This might have been because the line was so wide. Nevertheless, a fairly large group of undead managed to head north, and reporters would keep close calls on the daily shift of the front for the newspapers back home. Turkey by now had less than half their territory left. There were some who believed they were going to be the first to fall near Europe. With so much focus on Portugal and Spain, and so many units from other nations being sent to that front line, it was more difficult for the Turkish to defend their own front line. The zombies that previously had overrun Iran were getting closer and closer to the borders of neighboring countries. The Soviet Union had already set up and increased its defensive protocols in the mountainous border region. From the tops of the mountains, they would monitor any movement by the hour, and for now, no sign of danger could be spotted yet. With the zombie war expanding to new fronts, more nations decided to join the cause in the Allies. At the same time, new nations announced publicly they would also clash with the undead horde, the Soviet Union being one of them, despite not being part of the Allies. And again, the smaller countries continued to fall at the hungry jaws of this unholy evil. The war in Spain, however, has slowed down a bit, and it might turn in the favor of the living. With many nations having sent over reinforcements to the front, it became more difficult for the zombies to break through. Day in and day out, artillery bombardments, airstrikes, and armor assaults leveled entire mobs of zombies. But despite the zombies being slowed down, they were not countered and driven south yet. The same counted for Portugal, where the Portuguese were still hanging on by a mere thread. The bloodiest battle happened around Porto, and besides just Portuguese soldiers, many other Allied soldiers had arrived via sea to help their brothers in arms. In Africa, things had escalated regarding the Suez situation. The zombies had broken through and were heading south. There were not that many defensive outposts here, so the zombies, in a sense, had free reign. But there was a slight hope for mankind, since with more nations that joined the Allies, their power in the war had shifted as well. There were still millions of zombies out there, but if more would join, they might just be able to overcome this evil once and for all.